In the 1980s, when I was around 7 or 8 years old, my dad's father died. He lost a long-fought battle against cancer. I hate to say it like this, but I remember my family feeling relieved. The stress and pain my grandfather suffered was finally over. Now, my grandfather had been a man who saved his money, but never came around to spending it. And as my grandmother had long since passed, my father received everything from his father's will. My family received over $60,000 in the will, and after some time planning with my mother, my dad decided to put it towards his dream house. He wanted to return to the country lifestyle he grew up in. He thought the fields and woods would be a better place to raise my older brother and me. Soon, my parents bought a beautiful ranch-style home with 80 acres of land, much of which still had to be financed, but what they did receive from the will did cover most of it. I remember when I first walked through the doorway of the new home, it smelled like it was well-kept wood, the smell of freshly cut grass coming from the front door. My mother left it up to my brother and me to decide between ourselves which room belonged to each of us. This would be the first time having a room to myself. I was so excited that I didn't even care which room my brother picked. I do now wish, though, that I would have cared. I ended up with the room furthest away from my parents' room. This room was sizable, with 2 windows overlooking the fields outside. It also had a big closet that I had no idea what to do with. Lots of space for a boy who kept his clothes in a dresser. It was on the very first day there when strange occurrences began. Having told our parents which rooms we decided on, we started to unpack separately in our rooms. I was sitting in the back corner of the closet of my bedroom, figuring out how to stack my collection of board games, which were the only things I could think of to place in there at the time. I left my closet door open, as well as my bedroom door, so that the lights from the house and from outside would shine into the closet. The closet did have its own light source, one of those light bulbs with a pull string, but I had trouble reaching it, so I didn't even want to bother with it. I remember having just set down my Monopoly box when the closet door slammed shut. Instantly, I shot up and turned around. Without any light from the outside, the closet was pitch black. I called out my brother's name, assuming he was joking with me, but there was no reply. I ran towards the door, using the crack of light at the bottom as my guide. Then I looked around for the doorknob. I was relieved when I found it until I tried to turn it. It wouldn't move. It didn't make sense. The closet door didn't have a lock on the inside, or even on the outside of it. Why wouldn't it turn? As a scared kid, I could only assume my older brother was on the other side holding the doorknob still. We liked to joke with each other as all brothers do, but he had never been one to prank me like this. He was as much scared of the dark as I was. Moments after realizing that trying to open the door was pointless, I turned back towards the center of the closet. I reached my hand upwards, looking for the string to the light, or rather the feeling for it. It was difficult for me to reach out, but I knew if I could just feel the tip, I could jump up and pull it down, and the darkness would disappear. The longer I stepped blindly through the dark, the faster my heart was pounding. Being engulfed in darkness was a nightmare come true. Little did I know things would get worse. I did finally feel the small end of the string. Before I could jump up and try to pull the cord down, I felt something that took my breath away. An icy, cold hand from behind me. It placed itself on my neck and slowly ran up my cheek. I jumped and screamed so loud some of the blood vessels in my face busted. I practically tackled the wall next to me to get around the thing that had touched me. Quickly, I got towards the door and began to pound against it, screaming for anyone that might hear me. Moments later, my dad pulled the door open from the other side. I nearly fell on my face. I crawled out and quickly looked back into the closet. The darkness now cowered away from the light that flowed back through the open door. My dad picked me up and embraced me and looked at my face. Buddy, did you lock yourself in there? Jeez, look at your face. He wiped tears away from my red cheeks as he carried me to his and my mom's room to comfort me. I couldn't bring myself to tell him that the door didn't have a lock, but I was able to tell both of them what happened in there. But they blamed it on my intense fear of the dark. Specifically, my mom said, being that scared can make you see or feel things that aren't there, honey. She compared it to seeing figures or faces in the dark, when what you're actually looking at is a coat rack or a chair. As much as I love my parents, I didn't agree with what they said. The hand that I had felt was real, and I remember it clearly, even now. That hand was not my own, nor was it my imagination. Later on, when Dad went to my closet one night to grab one of the board games, I watched him do a double take when he opened the door. It was the first time he had actually taken a look at it. My dad looked at the doorknob over on both sides and raised an eyebrow. "Hey, buddy," he said as he checked out the closet door. "If you go in here, make sure you don't close the door or you might get stuck in there again. There's no lock, so it's most likely just warped or something." I nodded and did my best to believe him. Over the next few months, small but weird and creepy things would happen, especially in that part of the house towards my room. Dirty clothes that I would lay on the bedroom floor would often end up in the closet floor the next morning. When I began closing the closet door every night, out of fear of the darn thing, it would always be open in the morning. One day, when I was out playing after I had cleaned my room, my mom called me back inside, absolutely furious. When I went back inside to my room where my mom was, she was upset because of how trashy my bedroom was. She thought I hadn't cleaned it, but the state it was suddenly in was worse than I had ever seen it before. Every drawer in my dresser had been pulled out and dumped out. My blanket and sheet from my bedroom had been pulled off and tossed over the closet door, which was now open. Inside a closet were hundreds of board game pieces, as someone had dumped each of the boxes out onto the floor. I was shocked, but no matter what I said to my mom, she wasn't having it. She demanded that I clean my room before I was allowed to come out of the room. Obviously, I was upset, but I did as she said. I cleaned as fast as I could, folded all my clothes again, remade my bed, then stood at the opening to my closet. I couldn't bring myself to walk in there alone, especially after something or someone had just ruined my room, and I knew it wasn't my brother because we had both been outside. Why would my parents mess up my room? Deep down, I knew it was the thing in the closet. I stayed in that room 2 hours longer than I had to, unwilling to enter that closet to pick up the board game pieces. But when my stomach began to growl and the smell of homemade fried chicken filled the air, I forced myself up and into the closet. It took me a few tries, but I was able to jump up and catch the stream to the light, so at least I would have some light if I did get stuck in there again. Quickly, I started to pick up the pieces on the floor. It was a pain matching them up with the right boxes, as about a dozen different games had been mixed up. Every few seconds, I glanced at the closet door, making sure it stayed open. I thought nothing could happen if the light was on. I was wrong. I picked up the final piece, eventually, a small white ball that I'm pretty sure belonged in the Hungry Hungry Hippos box. I threw it in, closed up the box, and turned around. I stopped. A woman stood in the doorway. Her feminine shape made me first think it was my mother, but she was taller than her. Her hair was a mess and went down to her ribs. She stood facing away from me in a stained but light blue dress. She appeared to be looking out the windows of my bedroom. My voice failed me. I wanted to speak to her, but I had no idea what to say. I wanted to think it was some long-lost relative coming for a visit that I had never met before. and that I didn't know she was coming. Denial is a powerful thing. The woman was breathing in and out so slowly that I didn't even hear her breathing until long after I studied her. Her breathing was extremely slow and troubled, as if she had been a smoker for multiple lifetimes. Then, she lifted a bony finger and pointed towards one of the windows. I swear, she spoke. I think she said, "Such a nice day." Out of nowhere, in the blink of an eye, my vision was obstructed. I flinched away, first thinking that I had suddenly gone blind. But as I brought my hands up towards my face, I found greasy, messy hair covering my small form. Then that slow, struggling breathing came from behind me. This woman was no longer in the doorway. She was standing right behind me, with her hair draped over me. I screamed, and then I ran. I ran where I last saw the open closet door. And Jesus, this sounds crazy, but the few feet I ran to escape that closet, each inch of the way, I was going through that hair. Her breathing stayed in the same spot in the closet, but the hair seemed infinite, as if it was no longer coming from her head, and instead hanging from the ceiling. Only when I bursted out of the closet did the hair finally come to an end. I turned to shut the door and found once again the closet empty. These are a couple of my most terrifying experiences with what I would eventually refer to as the Witch of Donner Farm. Donner was the name of one of the previous owners of the land. I wish I could tell you that I figured out who she was, that we ended up moving, and that it all stopped. But we didn't move, and it never did stop. It would happen randomly, and things might calm down for months at a time. But she was always there, seemingly preferring my side of the house. The experiences only stopped after I moved out at the age of 20. If you want to hear more of these experiences, let me know. I'm sure most of you won't believe me. I'm a 21-year-old Navajo. I have family that lives on a plot of land south of Gallup. It's about a 30-minute drive to my family's land, and it's surprisingly not deep in the woods. I remember first being in close proximity with a witch when I was about 7. I was at my uncle's house. Our land has 3 homes on it. His, my mom's, and his girlfriend. They were drinking, and my uncle went to relieve himself out the front door. I remember he freaked out and said there was a skinwalker outside. I freaked out, and his girlfriend said it was okay, that it was just Scooby-Doo, attempting to lessen my fear. Since it's been so long, I remember those important details only after that. I have no memory of what happened. That uncle passed away that year, and I always think about what could have been between me and him, now that I feel so alone. And the rest of my family isn't amazing as he was with me. Anyways, to be clear, I have never seen a witch, but these details are unfortunately true. Jumping ahead a couple of years, I'm in 8th grade. My grandpa, who lived with my mom and me, is in the hospital. I ended up sleeping in his bedroom because I always slept on my mom's floor due to being creeped out by the thought of a witch trying to peer inside my window or hearing the noises it could make. I wanted to sleep in there because he had cable in his room. His room is on the opposite end of the trailer where my mom slept. It's about 5 a.m. and I wake up to the most terrifying language I ever heard. It sounded like a cross between a hyena and a pig. The constant chit-chat between whatever was outside my grandpa's window haunted me in that instance. I listened for a couple of seconds, but I covered my ears as hard as I could out of fear. It was the most scared I ever been. After the whole ordeal, I went to my mom's room and crawled into her bed, telling her what happened and shaking a bit. I had school that morning, so when we went to start the car, I noticed in the area where I heard the noise, there was a trailer hitch, and sitting in it was a stray dog. My grandma then hired a medicine man after that happened, and he said that dog was in cahoots with the witches. I tried to get rid of him, but that dog always came back. It was skinny. I always had a bad vibe from that dog, which doesn't happen as I love dogs. After that encounter, I was truly scared of being alone. A year later, during my freshman year of high school, my mom died. Whether or not those jealous witches were the cause of her death, I'll ponder once here and there. She died from a bad cold, mucus in her lungs. I was asleep in her bedroom, but not on her bed. I went to bed around 10 p.m., and in the morning, she was very weak and cold, like she was hallucinating and didn't get under the blankets to keep warm. When I woke up, she was dead, and sitting in front of her bed. That day changed my life completely, as I have never stayed at that house ever since she died. I stay with my dad now in town. My other grandpa said our family may be an active target of those evil witches. He said once in the 90s, when my uncles and their friends were at my grandma's land, they saw a fire and a witch doing a dance ritual on top of a mesa. They began to shoot at it. It sees them, and they take off when their girlfriends freak out. They leave, and the witch follows them from wherever they are. Keep in mind, this area has a lot of trees and isn't flat, like most of the Navajo Nation. My grandpa said that the witch followed my uncles back to where my family's land is. My family and the evil history of the area they settle at is real. I wouldn't type all this if it wasn't true. I don't like fake paranormal stories, and you wouldn't either if the paranormal was just a footstep away. After all the harm these witches have done, no one wants to talk about it or do anything about them. What is there to do? It's been 6 years now since my mom died. We saw what happened when my family interfered with this ritual and what ended up happening to all of them. So there are things out there that are just best left alone. I live in the downtown area of a major Texas city. To get away from the city and enjoy the outdoors and some alone time, I would make the hour-and-a-half drive almost every weekend to a small cabin that's in the woods owned by my family. I've been hanging out at that cabin in those woods almost my entire life, so I feel pretty comfortable there. The area doesn't have many people living there, and it's always safe. So one weekend, I took some of my friends out there to fish and spend some time away from the city. While fishing on the bank of the river that runs near my folks' cabin, we pulled up some chairs, started a fire, drank a few beers, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. That is life. After sitting around for a few hours, I suggested we go hunting the next morning for breakfast. The guys weren't big fans of waking up early to crawl around in the woods looking for something to eat. They would have rather stayed up all night drinking and fishing and wake up late the next day. "Let's just go hunting right now," said one of them. Everyone else agreed and started getting loud. I stayed put in my chair and replied, "Hell no, it's too late, it's too dark. We wouldn't be able to see a thing out there, man. Plus, there's those dang witches." Everyone knew I made a good point, but then one of them said, "Wait, what do you mean by witches? What are witches anyway? Like, seriously?" I laughed a bit because they all seemed so intrigued, and all of a sudden so focused. So I began telling the story of the last time I went camping and hunting in the woods around my parents' cabin. It was just like any other camping hunting trip I had gone out on. I packed a backpack with all the necessities, a .22 long rifle, an M&P, and a .45 that I would always carry. I parked my truck at my parents' place and walked down the dirt road until it disappeared into the woods. I make a point not to overhunt in any one area, So I hiked in a direction I knew I had never hunted in. After a few hours of hiking, I found a clearing in the woods that allowed some moonlight once it got dark. I don't use a tent when I camp alone, so setting up my camp was fairly easy. I got a fire going and quickly went to go find some small game for dinner before it got too dark. After bagging a few squirrels and a rabbit, I started to head back to my campsite. The night had already started to settle in, so it was getting quite dark on me. I took a moment to light up my lantern that was hanging off my backpack. I poured some lantern oil on it and got it going. A few hundred yards later, I heard a movement in the distance. Obviously, while moving through the woods with a backpack with a rifle strapped to it, you make a lot of noise yourself. However, the noises that came from deeper in the trees have a distinct sound, almost like an echo. So when I heard movement coming from somewhere else other than myself, I froze, staying completely still and listening. There was nothing. My brain started reasoning as fast as it could, and concluded that a branch might have fallen, or a deer might have gotten spooked and hightailed it out of the area. That was good enough for me, so I continued on through the dark in the direction I knew my campsite was in. The compasses don't lie, and I had learned how to use them and rely on them by this point in my life. I heard it, again. Noises coming from my right, north of where I was, and this time, I almost thought I heard a yell of some kind. Again, I froze, thinking it was coyotes. I'm not too worried about them, so I continued. The way back was starting to feel really long though, but hiking through the woods during the day is very different than hiking through the woods at night. Most of the time you hike slower, watching your steps more carefully, so it's not unusual that a hike the same distance could take longer at night than during the day. Before I go on, I feel like I should say that I was recently married at the time. Most likely less than a year at that point. Like I wrote before, I travel a lot throughout my life, and homesickness was not something I was familiar with until I met my wife. I'll call her Juliet. We met when we were both 18, and up until then, I had never missed my home or anyone whenever I was away. But once we started dating, I began to finally experience the feeling of being homesick whenever I was away for too long, and in some cases, not even long at all. That Friday evening, towards the woods I had left, I got home from work and sat down with Juliet for dinner before leaving. It had only been a few hours since I last saw Juliet, and yet I missed her so badly out here in these woods. So much so that I think I almost felt pain. Having said that, I think it's gonna make what happened next a little more creepy. Anyways, so I heard something. I froze and stood still in the dark woods and turned to my right. I was deeply confused because I knew what I just heard. It was Juliet calling me. Even though it sounded like she was a bit far, there was no doubt it was her. What the fuck is she doing out here? There's gotta be some sort of emergency. I gotta find her. She's most likely been calling my phone, and it's not even on. Something bad must have happened, I thought, as my mind raced to rationalize and come up with a realistic conclusion. Chip, Chip, she yelled through the trees in the distance. My name isn't Chip, but it's the secret nickname that she has for me. I basically jogged through the dark forest towards where I last heard her calling me, stopping every now and then to listen for her again. Eventually I had to stop because I had not heard Juliet call out to me for a while. I stood there quietly, panicking for what must have been like 5 minutes, but every second was torturous. I felt like I failed to find my wife, to help her. She came all the way out here to find me because she needed me, and I couldn't even find my fucking way to her. And then, that's when I heard it again. Chip, Chip. Her voice quietly resonated through the tall trees, and she sounded like she was in pain. I began to walk as quietly as I could towards her. so I could hear her if she called out to me again. And she did. She sounded very much closer, and I was relieved as I felt myself getting closer and closer to her. Chip, chip. This time, I was alarmed. I felt like I was about to be in danger, but I shook it off and continued towards my wife. Chip. Again. I kept listening to her calling me, but she didn't sound quite right. It almost sounded like it wasn't her at all. Just like two different people can say the same things in the same pitch and tone, but they can never sound exactly like each other. It was like there was someone else pretending to be my wife, and it was mimicking her voice, but I could hear her so clearly just a few moments ago. I figured she was choking up, trying not to cry, so I kept moving. Again and again, I heard my wife calling out to me as I kept getting closer and closer. Each time she called though, her voice sounded less and less like her. By the time she sounded like she was only 10 or so yards away, I was on high alert. It sounded nothing like her by then. Whoever it was calling me wanted me to believe she was my wife, and by then, I knew for sure it wasn't her. I approached carefully with my handgun drawn. This person wasn't moving one bit, but I could tell where she was. I started getting closer, inch by inch, holding my lantern up in front of me, trying to see who I was dealing with. Then, peeking from around a tree, I saw two eyes reflecting the flame from my lamp. I have to admit, at that moment, I was fucking terrified. My wife is shorter than I am, and I was eye to eye with whoever this was, and her eyes were too far apart to have been Juliet's eyes. "Hey, is everything alright?" I asked her, like an idiot. "I can give you anything you want." I knew right away what she really was. I knew her malicious intentions. "Jesus, help me," I said under my breath in a fearful whisper. With my gun still in my hand, I safely aimed towards the ground with my finger off the trigger. As soon as those words left my mouth, she visibly flinched as if she had smelled something disgusting. I could tell by her silhouette and the reflections in her eyes though. I stood still, realizing what I had just said, while she backed away from me back into the darkness. Up until this point during my story, my buddy sat staring at me, completely silent, listening to me speak. "Dude, why the fuck didn't you just shoot her? You had a gun, didn't you?" said the youngest guy. I told him it would have been useless to shoot the witch out there. It wouldn't have killed her, or done any harm to her. "How? Why?" he replied. I began to explain to them what witches really are. People who practice witchcraft and offer rituals to demons they conjure in return for something they want. My theory was that this witch achieved her position through the sacrifice of people and animals. I could tell they were thinking it over and trying to decide whether to believe me or not. And to those listening, I know y'all might think this is crazy and not believable, and if I hadn't seen it at all before, I myself wouldn't even believe it. But the truth is, my parents were and still are very prominent figures in the church I grew up in. Being elders of the church community, they often perform exorcisms when I was a kid. And no, I don't mean the stereotypical Hollywood Catholic priest with a little white thing on his neck under a black jacket, holding up a wooden cross. They belonged to a Hispanic Protestant denomination that in fact disagreed with and opposed Catholicism. Being too young to stay home alone, I was often taken with my parents on house calls to pull demons out of people. It was a horrible experience every single time. In Latino America culture, it's not uncommon for people and their kids to visit witch doctors, or even doctors who heal when somebody is feeling sick, or when they want their lives to move in a better direction. and sometimes when they want harm to come upon someone who has wronged them. However, being part of these rituals is like an open invitation for demons and leaves people open to demonic activity. So there was always someone in need of help in our community. I watched and listened to everything my parents did during exorcisms, and I had read every book my dad kept in his office about the subject. By the time I had this incident in the woods, I already knew what to do and what not to do very well. I continued my story after explaining a bit more to my buddies. As I was saying, I stood in the dark forest with my lamp held up, with my arms stretched out until I could no longer see or hear the witch backing away. My adrenaline took a while to finally settle down. Then, that's when the fear came. I tried walking back to my campsite quietly, but my nerves got the best of me, and I ended up almost running through the darkness. I was pretty confident I could find my way back, but either way, I kept checking my compass. After running and running in the correct direction, I never reached my campsite. I felt confused and doubted myself like never before. Maybe I really don't know anything about being out in the woods. How could I have gotten myself so lost? I turned around and walked until I saw a familiar pattern in the trees. Once I felt confident about where I was, I forced myself to walk back to where I ran into that witch. When I found the tree she was initially hiding behind, I stared at it for a good while, expecting her to peek around it again, but nothing. Thankfully, I retraced my steps back to where I had gone off the path to follow Juliet's voice. After hiking a bit longer, I found my campsite. I was exhausted, covered in sweat, scratched up, and hungry. I considered packing everything up and starting on the long walk back to the cabin, but I had no energy, so I called it a night. I didn't even sleep much even though I felt entirely drained. The woods were very loud that night, even by a summer night standard. The bugs and animals didn't stop to take a breath for a second, and the owls were very aggressive as well. I could hear them screaming near and far all night. Every time I began to drift off to rest, I would get awakened to the screams of the owls, echoing in the forest. Or at least that's what I assumed to be. I turned to look at the guys and asked them if they were still down to creep into the woods. They looked at each other and said, "Yes." "Well, y'all go ahead. I'm not going in there right now," I said, laughing to myself. "But it didn't even do anything to you. You scared her away," one of them replied. "Maybe, but it's only because I said the name of Jesus," I said. "Well, just say it again if she comes back, dude," he said, almost annoyed. "It's not that simple. I think you really have to believe for that to work. And I can say I really did believe back then. But now, I won't be calling on anyone to come help me." After I said that, I don't remember much about the night, other than that all of us ended the night by watching Blood Diamond in the cabin. It's the only movie that my parents have in there. I think it was already there when they bought the place. As for what I said about believing, I'm not 100% sure it's right. Most demons hate God and Jesus, and I'm not sure if they care if you believe in God or not. It's not that I don't believe in God anymore. However, the only reason I do believe is because I've seen the other side of things. That witch that I saw knew what I loved and what I missed, and that I would have done anything for my wife. I have seen, encountered, and even felt evil, but I have never felt God. La Llorona, a story from my grandmother that has been passed down to warn others that if you decide to visit Mexico, you may just encounter something terrifying and paranormal. Well, let me explain first that I'm not talking about visiting Mexico like the resorts in Cancun. I'm talking about the deep villages in Mexico and the ranchos, which is where the story takes place. My grandmother lived in a small village in Mexico with just a handful of streetlights and friendly neighbors. Everyone knew everybody, and my grandmother had 6 siblings, 5 brothers, and a sister. She recalled that her brothers used to hang around with the other neighbor boys, running around, playing games and causing trouble. There wasn't a whole lot else to do in a small port village. One day, while her brothers were out, my grandmother, her sister, and her mother stayed home, doing some chores and preparing dinner. As the sun went down and her children got back late, her mother decided to scold them, as any mother would. But when the boys returned, they were visibly terrified. They had been running and slamming themselves into the small wooden doorway of their mother's house. My grandmother's older brother finally spoke up, crying and clinging to her mother's apron. He said, "La Llorona nos anda persiguiendo. Nos está diciendo que la sigamos. The crying woman is following us. She's telling us to follow her. She's still behind us." At first, my grandmother thought they were making it up to avoid punishment. But when she looked in the direction they came from, she heard something and saw a shadow passing back and forth under the lone streetlight. A loud, desperate cry filled the night. Her mother, surprisingly, began laughing and told the boys to go eat. She waved her hands and said, "You are not welcome here. Go find someone else who will actually listen." The shadow continued to sway, and for a brief moment, my grandmother saw a long-haired figure. Then, as quickly as La Llorona had appeared, she swayed again and disappeared. Her mother laughed and scolded the boys, emphasizing the importance of listening to their parents. My grandmother always considered her mom to be a brave woman who believed in all these things and warned them not to provoke it. She often shared these stories as both entertainment and moral lessons. The scars that her uncles bore served as a warning. Be careful at night and be wary of the cries if you're ever staying in Mexico. I'm a child of 2 Mexicans who were both born in Oaxaca, Mexico. For those of you familiar with the state of Oaxaca, y'all know how beautiful and rich in culture it is. And for those of you who haven't heard of Oaxaca, you need to visit at some point in your life. Not right now, because it wouldn't be responsible to travel with COVID being at its highest with its different variants. Anyways, I grew up visiting Oaxaca every summer, because that is where my parents' families are, and they wanted my siblings and I to have a connection with our family there. Well, going every year and spending time there, a lot of scary, unexplainable stories were told to us. Some of them happened to my dad's family, or my mom and her family. I was always fascinated with these stories because I've always been a fan of all scary things. I love me some horror, so I would always ask my parents to tell me stories whenever our entire family was together, especially when we would have a bonfire. With that being told, I can now talk about one of the stories that my dad has told me that has happened in his pueblo, or village. I will not say what pueblo it is, because it does not matter, and I would not want to expose my dad's village like that. So here we go. In this pueblo, there are tales of people, mostly men, who turn into some type of werewolf animal on specific nights. I know what you're thinking, because it's the same thought I had. Werewolves. Like from Harry Potter, or from Twilight. But I'm not talking about those. Those are fictional. The creatures that I am talking about are creatures that look like werewolves, but they're different, and these are called naguales. They turn during a full moon, and only during specific seasons in the year. They turn at night, and turn back into their human forms in the morning. They know when they're gonna turn, and are aware of what they are doing and what they should not be doing. So there was a man in this pueblo that had a farm where his chickens kept turning up dead in the mornings, and he had no idea what or who had killed them. He was furious because his chickens were his form of business, and since it kept happening, he decided to have a stakeout and have a rifle ready to shoot the animal that was attacking his livestock. When nighttime came around, he was hiding near where his chickens were kept, and when he saw the werewolf-looking animal, he shot it, and it left running and crying. When daytime came around, the farmer assembled a search party to look for the creature that he had shot the night before. They looked everywhere in the woods, and they didn't find the corpse of an animal, and instead followed a trail that randomly stopped. However, there was a man that had to go to the hospital the night before because he had been shot, and when the doctors asked what happened, he didn't give a single explanation to have been shot. The entire pueblo heard one single gunshot that night, but no animal was found. Yet there was a man with a single gunshot wound that appeared and could not explain who had shot him. Was it a coincidence? I will let you all decide that. This is going to be short because this just started happening in the last 5 days. There really isn't much background story except that my brother has been acting weird since he got back from a sleepover at a friend's house 6 days ago. By weird I mean distant, quiet, and most important, his presence in our house has felt off and a little strange, like it doesn't feel like him anymore. You know when your parents had a friend over, except to you, he or she is a complete stranger, and whenever you're in a room with them or near them, you feel uncomfortable because they're actually someone that you don't really know, so you can't speak to them or find it difficult to make conversation. That's what he feels like. 5 days ago, I woke up at 3:45 a.m. and looked at my door. It was slightly open, and I could see my brother standing there, grinning. This of course scared the shit out of me and made me jump. I walked out and turned the hallway lights on, and that's when I noticed that his eyes were shut, but he was still grinning and breathing very lightly. I quickly jumped to the conclusion that he's just sleepwalking, so I led him back to his bed and left. I didn't talk to him about it the next day because I thought it was a one-time thing. I didn't wake up on the 4th day, but it's safe to say that he was standing there staring at me. 3 days ago, I woke up and saw him standing there again. This time the door was fully open, and he was grinning from ear to ear. Now call me paranoid, but I'm 98% sure there was someone or something, a presence maybe, behind him. 4 a.m. and he went back to sleep. I wasn't home on the 2nd day, so nothing happened to me except for a weird dream where I was in a bedroom and he was in the corner, grinning with his eyes wide open. However, last night, that was the scariest. I woke up at 3:20 and I noticed him standing there again. This time, he was smiling. His teeth were visible, except it was an inhuman smile. It looked like his teeth were those of a shark and spread across his face in an unnatural manner. Everything was silent. My window was flapping from the wind, but I couldn't hear anything. It felt like I was in a void. Then he started to creep up slowly towards me, and I tried to move, but I couldn't. I literally could not move my body or my head. It was like a force on my chest holding me down, and my hands and legs being held down. I couldn't close my eyes or even say anything. I just slept there in fear, like I had never felt so scared in my life. In my head, I knew it was my brother, but it didn't feel like him. I felt like I was gonna die. He got up to my face, and I mean dead center, and he just stopped there and looked at me. His eyes were not open, but fuck me, it felt like they were. His breathing got heavier and heavier. I started crying. Actual tears from being scared dripping down my face. 30 minutes. We were like that for 30 minutes. But it felt like hours. Close to 3:55 a.m. He stopped, and the expression changed to that of an evil look again. He clenched his fist and punched me on my face in a hammering-like motion and caused my nose to bleed. Like he was punching me on my face and I couldn't move or scream or do anything. So I just lay there and took it. I won't forget what he said. He came up to my ear and whispered, "You're gonna die in this house." Then went back to his room. The second his door closed, I felt this surge of energy and I jumped out of bed and fell on the ground. I was panicking and breathing heavy. I didn't know what to do. I went into the bathroom and cleaned myself up by washing blood off my hands and nose and went downstairs. I sat there all morning until everyone was up. I fell asleep on the sofa and I didn't see him leave, but I saw him come back, but he went straight to bed. It's 2 a.m. right now, and I'm sitting in the living room with the lights on, the TV on, and I'm on the laptop just waiting. I'm not sure what's gonna happen, but I'll let you guys know. Last night, some shit got weird. Really weird. At 3:15 a.m., I sat downstairs, lights on, wide awake, ready to see what would happen. 3:30 a.m., I'm in the kitchen. Sounds normal, right? But I don't remember walking there or how I got to the kitchen. I'm just there, staring at my fridge. I turned around and noticed that my fridge was my only source of light. 3 knocks, continuously, coming from the kitchen window. Someone was knocking outside. These knocks came in 3s, 6 times. Then I turned to face my door, and there he was, just standing there. The best I can describe it this time is that his entire body was blacked out, including his face. He stood there and the only thing visible was his open wide eyes, and they were more white than normal. I could make out that he was grinning, ear to ear. I tried calling his name, but every time I did, he just shook his head in a violent manner and making this squealing sound. I tried calling his name again, and his head shook and turned even more violent to the point that it made me feel sick. He kept shaking his head, so I tried to move close to the lights to turn it on, and that's when he stopped and smiled in a way that made me jump out of my skin. I jumped back and said his name again, but this time he shook his head and said no. This time louder, loud enough that my parents easily should have woken up from it. I looked at the window, and when I looked back, my brother wasn't there anymore. I turned the lights on, and of course, they didn't fucking work. I tried stepping out of the kitchen, and this is the weird part. Every time I walked out, I walked back in, if that even makes sense. It was like I would walk out of the kitchen, but somehow end up back at the entrance walking in, and every time I tried to walk out, I just felt sick. Like I shouldn't leave the kitchen by all means, but at the same time, I didn't feel safe in there. That place felt like it had no other presence, but only that of an evil thing. I tried running out, and sure enough, I found myself in a loop where I just ran back into the kitchen. This time, my brother was there, and he had a knife in his hands. He was dark black. His whole body was blacked out, except his eyes. They were the only thing that had some sort of color to him. I even thought of the possibility that my brother was still upstairs asleep, and that this was someone else, or better yet, something else. We stood there for what felt like hours. Then he ran at me with a knife and started swinging. I grabbed him trying to stop him, and his body felt hot. Incredibly hot. bad enough that I couldn't hold him for long. I thought of screaming, but I couldn't. I really couldn't. I felt like something was choking me, making it harder for me to breathe or talk. So I kicked the fridge till something fell and broke on the ground. Now, we were on the floor. He was on top of me and had a knife inches away from my throat. His body temperature switched, then turned cold. Then he started saying what I'm gonna assume is Latin words. And then all of a sudden he just stopped. He stopped trying to force the knife into me and just stared at me. His face was inches away from mine, and he smiled at me, and his eyes became wider than normal. I felt nothing during that moment. It was like he got me or something. We just lay there like that, his white eyes and sharp dagger teeth inches away from my face, and me just laying there looking at him emotionless. That's when my parents started shuffling about upstairs, and then he did something that's gonna stay with me forever. He opened his mouth, and everything was blacked out, and he screamed in this inhuman manner. If I'm being honest, I heard at least several different voices in that scream. I pushed him off of me, and he moved across the kitchen near the kitchen window, and he stood up. My parents came downstairs and turned the lights on. I put the knife down and looked at my brother, who was back to normal, but he looked like he had just woken up. He asked why he was down there. My parents looked at us confused, and I said I saw him sleepwalking, so I followed him downstairs. My mom looked at the kitchen counter and saw the knife. Then she looked at me and saw hand marks and bruises all over my hands from the fight I had with him. She asked why the knife was there, and I said someone was knocking at the window and we got scared. She looked at me, then to my brother, and then at my dad, who all looked just very confused. They told us that they heard us making loud noises and knocking around, so they woke up. I said we weren't doing anything. My dad then got annoyed and told us to get back to bed. I led my brother back upstairs. I caught a glimpse of my mom when we walked back, and she smiled at my brother, but looked at me, and her expression changed to a concerned look. I haven't told this story in a long time. It happened to me in October, about 6 years ago. I told 4 or 5 people since then, and nobody believed me. I had a lot of time to think about it since then, and I think I'm finally ready to post my story somewhere. It's about a weekend I spent in the national forest. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I made sure I had the weekend off work. I didn't make any plans. I started buying supplies a week before I went. I was gonna go camping in the forest near my town. I had been camping before when I was a little kid with my parents, but never as an adult, and never by myself, and never in this forest. So I was pretty excited. Now I'm not stupid. I took all the necessary precautions. I told a few of my friends where I was going, when I was going, and when I would be back. I told them if I go missing to call the cops and all of that. I brought an extra phone battery and enough food and water to last me a fucking week. I even brought along my firearm that my dad gave me when I turned 18. I never shot the damn thing, but I figured it would at least scare off whatever the hell wanted to mess with me. I'm telling you all this so you know that I'm not just some dumb kid who decided that he wanted to take a trip to the forest one day and shit himself because of what he saw. I knew what I was getting into. I was ready, just not for, well, this. So enough backstory, I'll get on with it. I left around 6 in the morning. It's an hour drive from my place, so I was expecting to get there around 7. I ended up getting there at 7:30, but I didn't mind. It was a lovely day, not a cloud in the sky, great weather, so I was pretty satisfied with the time that I got there. I parked my car ways away from the forest, in a little clearing off the side of the road where I knew I would find it. I gathered all my things, had a little snack, and headed off towards the forest. The next few hours are kind of boring, so I'll skip over them. All you need to know is that I made my way into the forest and set up camp. I cooked myself lunch on the crummy campfire I made around noon. I saw a pair of birds dancing at each other. I even took a few pictures of some deer I saw with my phone. I couldn't get a good shot, but at least it's proof that I was there. However, something seemed off. You see, the forest is normally kinda loud. Not like city loud, but there's this constant background noise that is always going on. Rustling in the bushes, leaves, birds chirping, and animals prancing around. When I first got into the forest, that was all well and good, but the later it got, the sounds just started to go away. It took the better part of the day for me to notice. Birds stopped chirping, the bushes stopped rustling. I stopped seeing animals too. That's actually what made me notice. At around 4 in the afternoon, I realized that I hadn't seen a bird in a while. That actually kinda creeped me out a little bit, but I brushed it off and kept enjoying the stay. I was feeling kinda lonely, with everything being so quiet, so I called up a friend and talked with him till sundown. After that, I realized it was getting late, so I hung up. I ate again and put out the fire. After a final assessment of my surroundings and looking at the night sky, I crawled into my tent to sleep. I kept my gun loaded right next to where I slept, just in case, you know. Sleeping on the cold ground in the middle of a forest isn't that easy if you aren't used to it. And considering I hadn't done it since I was a child, I was having a little trouble. It was around 2 hours after I had laid down that I started hearing something in nature again. Now, if I had heard bushes rustling a few hours earlier, this would have been cause for celebration. But even Bear Grylls himself would have gotten creeped out if this was the only thing that he had heard all night. So I did what any rational human would have done and clung to the gun like it was the only thing keeping me from falling off a cliff. There was silence for a few minutes. The only thing I could hear was my own shaky breath. Then, no crunching of leaves or snapping of twigs, just the same. It was getting louder, closer to my tent. I tried to peer through the fabric that separated me from nature, but I couldn't make out a silhouette. I clutched the rifle harder, scared as any person would. I remember being sure that I would be safe though. Even bears are rare to attack camps unprovoked. But that natural human fear that was overbearing, making my mind wander and my hands shake. It stopped, close to my tent, just outside my tent. I could feel its presence near me. It was totally silent. I knew it couldn't be a bear. It would be sniffing the tent right now if it was. I doubted it was a deer. They don't come out at night. Perhaps a wolf? They normally travel in packs. And even if it were a lone wolf, it wouldn't be a threat until I heard growling. But nothing. Just silence. And then, a screech. That's when I knew that this thing wasn't anything I had seen before. Nothing makes that sort of sound. It was like a cross between some sort of bird and a human. Like the shit that you hear in movies that possesses people with their heads on backwards make. That's when I let fear take over in my bladder and in my hands. I fired the gun in its direction, and oh God, was that a mistake. It screeched again, and it scratched the tent, tearing through the fabric, leaving a massive gash in the side. That was my first look at it, if that's even what you could call it. I barely saw a silhouette through the hole in my tent, but I did see its long arms shredding the side of the tent. It was trying to get to me. I fired the gun again, but I must have missed because it didn't flinch. That's when the flight reflex took over the fight, and I only wanted to do one thing: run. I turned around and fiddled with the opening of the tent, trying to keep my eye on the beast attacking me, but also trying to secure my escape as fast as I could. I did it, and dove out of the tent, breaking into a full sprint. Behind me, I heard the thing still tearing into my tent. I thought that maybe it was mistaking its enemy or prey for the tent and not me, but that relief didn't last long. I wasn't far from the tent when I heard it prancing again. It was faster than me, gaining on me. If I tried to outrun it, I would surely be caught. Just then, in what was my crazy thinking, I stopped and dove into a thick bush near me. I remember that many animals in the forest rely on seeing movement more than anything else, so if I could stay still, then it would not see me, and this decision saved my life. It ran past me, stopping in the same place where I stopped. I didn't notice before I hid, but that spot is just under an opening in the trees. A pillar of light penetrated the darkness, and in the moonlight, I could see this thing. It was pale, and it was made even more pale by the white of the moon, and hairless, thin, like it had not ate in weeks. I want to say it looked humanoid, but comparing that thing to a human is just wrong. Its hunchback protruded out, making it look larger than any human. It stood on all fours in such a way that no human could. Its legs bent in such a fashion that it almost resembled a frog, ready to leap. It circled around, silently searching for me. I thought it was about to give up, but it threw its horrendous back upwards, and its legs straightened, and it stood on two legs, like a human, a deformed, horrific human. And then, it looked right at me. It saw me. I know it saw me. Nothing looks at you like that without seeing you. I could tell you the color of its damn eyes, and I bet you that it could tell you the color of mine. I clutched the gun close to my chest, too scared to use it, too scared to move. I closed my eyes and waiting for it to pounce, and then I opened my eyes and it was gone. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I fell asleep in that bush, clutching my gun, until finally being awoken by the sounds of birds. Birds. Thank God, it's birds. It was already daylight. The next morning, I stood up and the things around me seemed normal. The forest was speaking once again, and there were birds and deer everywhere. I stumbled back to my camp to find my things mostly as I had left them. My tent was unsalvageable, but I took my backpack, had something to eat, and then I left, just like I had planned. The entire trek back, I didn't stop looking around for that thing. I didn't let the gun leave my hands either. It wasn't until I got to the car that I relaxed, calling my friend to tell him I was heading home. I didn't tell him about what happened last night. I was still trying to process it myself. Shit, I don't even think I understand what happened until after the car ride home. And that's where the story ends. 6 years ago, and I haven't gone camping since then. I haven't even seen the thing again, nor have I heard of anyone who's seen it. My life has moved on completely, but I will never forget that thing. I will never forget how it stared at me, and then how it just left. It knew I was there, but it left. I don't know why it did that, and I don't think I'll ever get an answer. In the traditional Navajo way, skinwalkers are seen as witches, but they weren't always seen that way. My late grandmother, who was a medicine woman that practiced the blessings way, told me of the origins of the skinwalker. Being a skinwalker wasn't always seen as a bad thing. In fact, they were seen as people with amazing gifts. They could change into the form of any animal, run a certain distance very quickly, mimic people's voices, and some were known to use magic. During the colonization, skinwalkers were used to relay messages between war camps and spy on the enemy without being detected. Having the skinwalker abilities was a gift. Whenever we lost, the good of the community took a backseat, and people began to focus on themselves instead of sharing what you had. People began to look after their own families, claiming property and livestock, and there were people that got the short end of the stick. Jealousy is a terrible thing. People became jealous of one another, wanted more fortunate people to lose what they had. They looked to skinwalkers who had otherworldly powers to do their bidding. Now, being a skinwalker is not a gift. You condemn yourself to a life of unhappiness and anger. In order to become a skinwalker, you must sacrifice someone that you love very much. This shows that you are indeed committed to depravity. The interesting thing is that you could have met a skinwalker and not even know it. They are people like you and me. They have chosen a path in which they will hurt other people. We burn clothing and personal items of deceased relatives, and it is very taboo to keep anything that belongs to the dead. Keeping such items can make a person sick or suffer horrible events in their life. However, skinwalkers surround themselves with death. Skinwalkers have been known to grave rob and search through people's garbage. They use bones and hair from the dead and victims' personal items to create bundles. They place these bundles near a person's home, and bad luck will fall upon the person. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the story that I'm about to tell you is about my older sister. In her younger days, my sister was very much interested in the rodeo scene. My family actually has a pretty impressive legacy when it comes to the sport. My sisters didn't compete, but had plenty of friends and family that would go and watch. My two sisters would travel around the Southwest following the rodeo circuit. The cowboy lifestyle isn't always glamorous. It can be filled with alcohol, drugs, and depression. Unfortunately, this took hold of my sister, and she got in trouble with the law. My sister was looking at jail time, and the family was very concerned about what might happen to her. My mother went to a local medicine man, and they talked about the next steps. They decided to have a ceremony for my oldest sister. A few days passed, and it was time for the ceremony. The medicine man and his wife showed up a little past dusk. They came into our house and we served them the food we had made. Everyone chatted for a little bit, and when we finished eating and cleaned up, it was time to start. Everyone sat down in the living room in a circle. The medicine man sat on the far west side of the room. My older sister sat to the left. In the middle of the circle was a large pile of sand that was smoothed out on top. My uncles got hot coals from the fire and placed them on the sand. The medicine man started praying in Navajo and sang blessing songs. This went on into the night. At the height of the ceremony, the medicine man turned to my oldest sister and told her that they would have to go outside and pray in the darkness, and he told her not to look around as he is singing. He told her to keep her eyes on him. The medicine man, my sister, and my uncle went outside. The medicine man turned around and began singing into the darkness. My sister was watching him sing, trying to keep her focus on only him. Then, she heard it. Off in the distance, she heard someone whistle. This made her feel sick to her stomach. Our elders tell us about our culture's taboos, starting at a young age. One of the biggest things that they stress is to never whistle at night. They tell us only the dead whistle at night. So when my sister heard whistling out in the darkness, fear gripped her heart. She was so scared that tears began to well up in her eyes. The whistling got louder and louder, as if whatever it was moving closer and closer. My uncle was outside during the prayer. He admits that he was scared too, but he wanted to be there for my sister. What my uncle saw was even more miraculous. He claims that as the medicine man sang, a bundle came from up above. The eagle feathers that the medicine man was holding opened up like a hand. The bundle gently floated down into the feathers, and the feathers closed around the bundle. The medicine man stopped singing, and the group went back into the house. My sister stumbled in, clearly shaken from the experience. The medicine man could see how my sister was. She then asked him what was whistling. He told her it was a skinwalker, and that he was trying to call the bundle back to it. We gathered around to see what was in the bundle. The medicine man opened up what looked to be a leather pouch. Inside of the pouch was a bone about 1 inch wide and 3 inches long. Upon closer inspection, the bone was hollow, and more items were shoved inside of the bone, held in place with twigs and dirt. He dissected the bone to find hair and pieces of a shirt that belonged to my sister, and a very tiny drawing of a woman behind bars. Whatever was calling out to this bundle had very ill intentions for my sister. Fortunately, after the ceremony, all of my sister's charges were dismissed. I asked my sister what they did with the bundle, and she said that she wasn't really sure. She says that she remembers being very scared when they were outside singing. My sister controls her emotions very well, and so I can't even begin to imagine how scared she must have felt in that moment. So if you ever hear whistling out at night, don't ever acknowledge it. I myself am not Navajo, but my friend is. He grew up around Gallup, New Mexico. He loves to tell me stories about skinwalkers. He knows it gives me the chills. According to him, they are not like werewolves, but are dark spirits that use the skins or even the flesh of anything living that may serve its purpose. They will also use animal parts as totems. For example, they will take the claws from a bear or the antlers from a deer. They are known to come after humans too, but he says that's a native thing and that white people have nothing to worry about. He says the only way to make it stop bothering you is to take away its disguise. The scariest story he tells is about this Navajo trucker that his father knows. Every night he makes the long run to the reservation from Gallup. One night, when halfway there, he hears a loud noise against the front passenger side of his truck. Thinking he might have hit something, he pulls off to the shoulder of the road to take a look, but he finds nothing, not even a mark or dent on the fender. So he gets back on the road and resumes driving. But only a few seconds later, he sees something in his rear view mirror towards the middle of the road and moving up on him. And it's not another vehicle. Then, just as suddenly as it appears, it's gone. Shrugging it off, he goes back to paying attention to the road. With his semi going about 60 miles per hour, he chances to look in his mirror, and again, he sees this thing chasing him, and it is moving fast. Just like that, it's at his driver's door, and holding onto the handle and striding along. Then, without warning, it turns to him with its dog-like face and dull, dark eyes, and smashes in the window. The driver slams on the brakes. The cab of the truck goes into a slide, the trailer jackknifing past him. The whole time, this creature is holding on to the door and reaching in through the broken window trying to grab him. Somehow, the truck comes to a stop, blocking both lanes of the road straight across. The driver is so scared, he doesn't even notice the creature is gone, and instead throws the door open and runs off into the desert. Now, he must have passed out or something, because he awakes with the sun coming up and finds himself huddled by this rock formation. He's dusty, a little dirty, and missing his shirt, but is otherwise unharmed. Sitting there gaining his bearings, the events of the previous night come back to him. He gets up to his feet, dusts himself off, and walks out back to the highway, not knowing what to expect with his truck. However, as he reaches the road, he sees it parked as neat as it can be there on the shoulder. When he gets up to it, he sees there's nothing wrong with the driver's door window. It's as if he imagined the whole thing. He does notice, however, a series of small scratches on the driver's door all around the handle, as if something was clawing at it. These marks were not there previously. My grandfather told me a story once, as we sat around a campfire in his backyard in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear, and each star twinkle in a purple sky, with a full fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide dark eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy, about your age, I lived outside a reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war and set about raising horses and cattle on a 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside with good dirt for growing thorn brush and not much else. One night, my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip into town, about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek and some old abandoned farmsteads. Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember it so much. The engine began to sputter, and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. "Damn it," Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road. As it coasted to a stop, my pa said, "Stay here, son," and he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool down the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up the smell of one of those dead, bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crows pecked enough holes in their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk, and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too. The back of my neck felt itchy, and my face started to get very hot. The wind stopped blowing, with the stink filling the cab. "Pa," I called out. No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, in my chest. I tell you, I never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam. Not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over for my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road through both dim beams of light across the partly open hood. Grandfather paused telling the story. He spit a fat piece of tobacco to his side, and he looked very pensive into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath and gasped for air. The night was breezy, but I was sweating and clammy. "What about your father? What did you see?" My grandfather, continuing the story, sighed. "A creature." He shook his head. "You have to understand, there were legends. Old legends. Much older than what's out there in the valley. Older still than Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, than the old chiefs and their shamans, the Apache and Hopi and Cherokee, and all them old tribes and First Peoples. They told tales. They told stories about dark magic. Something about a deal made with the old spirits of blood sacrifice to gain power, old power, enough to fight each other and the Spaniards, and later the white man that came for their land and women. They called them." He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath and looked towards the fire, to the sky, the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and then leaned a little bit and said, "They would call them Skinwalkers, old warriors, resurrected as skinless men, walking on deer legs with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote, but they were messed up, long and disfigured, teeth like a Bowie knife, long arms, and standing 7 feet tall, even hunched over. They would gut the old cowboys and white riders. They'll run through the bullets, part the Spanish armor like it was a potato sack. And boy, Could they change their voice to match a person you knew or might know? And that's what I saw. Big and fast. Only for a second. It ran across the road. Gray and molted. Muscle flexing under its legs. Clumping on the road. Stringy muscle hunched shoulders. And it turned. Looked right into the cab. And looked at me. Right into my eyes. And I swear, it grinned at me. I sank into my seat. In fear, shaking, I knew my death was coming. I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before the lightning comes and blows a tree to smithereens, charged and full with power. I yelled for Pa, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I started to shake as my grandfather told his story. He was still here, so I knew he lived. But the supernatural always fascinated me, and even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so they could take others. Not for long, the legend says, maybe an hour, before the soul of the skin that they were wearing would come looking for their mortal shell before going to whatever hell awaited them. Even though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened, and I jerked my head to the left, putting up my hands to fend off an attack. "Son, it's me," my father said. Before climbing into the cab, he got the steering wheel and pulled himself in an awkward way, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. Your great-grandfather was a good man. Treated me and my mom right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of man in Poland when he freed all those camps. And now, I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run? Or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your mom, as he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it out into the road. And our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom? I knew, because out the window, out the corner of my eye, I saw that same beast running 50 miles an hour right next to our car, looking at me with those yellow eyes and grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us. My pa kept his eyes on the road, looking straight ahead. "Son," he said, "don't look at it." That's how I knew it was my dad. He knew what to do, and he kept telling me to just keep looking straight ahead and to not look at whatever was around us, running. He then told me that by acknowledging its presence, you give it power. That's where my grandfather finished the story. I kept staring at him, but by this time, he was just looking straight ahead, looking around me, and said we should go inside. As we went inside the house, he then told me to not ever mention skinwalkers. He also said that speaking their name out loud or mentioning them at all, even in text, even in stories, even if someone else is telling you a story, is supposed to make them aware of your existence. To give some perspective on the scenario, we live in an apartment complex at the edge of town in Illinois. Right next to us is a woody area full of coyotes and deer and lots of birds, so it's pretty lively. Last night at 3 a.m., my fiance went outside to grab a case of water from the trunk of our car, and when she was grabbing it, she claimed she heard someone say, "Hello," in a girl's voice coming from the woods. She said she couldn't see anything, but she replied back, confused, saying hello back. Whatever it was, ended up saying, "Can somebody help me?" And that's when she got the chills and ran as fast as she could back inside our house. Right before she entered the house, she said that she heard it again, with the voice getting closer, asking for help. But instead of a normal girl voice, it turned into a girl voice that didn't even sound real, and she couldn't explain the change in the voice. She said afterwards, thinking about it, that her voice sounded familiar, but couldn't point out whose voice. Why I believe she wasn't BSing around is because 2 years living here, we never talked about things like this. And when she rushed inside, she startled me because her face was in shock and she was breathing heavily, almost like I thought she seen something or heard a gunshot. I don't know. My question is, she thinks it was a skinwalker, because who would be out at 3 a.m. asking for someone to help them in the woods? What do you guys think? I also read online that you aren't supposed to interact nor share the encounter that you had about a skinwalker. She will be alright this one time sharing the story. I hope. This next story comes from Gallup, New Mexico. A Navajo woman, now in her late 60s, recalls the time when she is yet a little girl. She has this feeling there is someone outside their house. She runs to her father, who is still in bed, the sun just starting to come up. After finally begging her father to get up, he gets out of bed, puts on some shoes, and goes out to the yard to check. Walking around towards the side of the house to which her bedroom is situated, he notices what appears to be a coyote or dog prints there in the soil directly below her window. The strangest thing out of all this is that there is a trail consisting of only one clear print, and beside it, a round impression, which seems to sit a bit deeper. If there was a coyote outside her window, it was standing upright and on one canine-like foot, and something that's not canine-like. While he is making his way back into the house, something across the way catches his eye. There, upon a small hill to the other side of the dirt road, is a strange-looking old man. His eyes refracting the early sunlight, his hair long and yellowing, and his clothes worn and dirty, ripped apart. But what's more strange out of all this is that he is standing there, barefoot, missing the lower part of his other leg, and supporting himself with the aid of a simple cane of wood. This story is from Fort Belknap. 2 of my friends and I are by the street in front of my house, hanging out and talking. I noticed down the block, a ways underneath the halo of the street light, there's this dog. It's just sitting there, but it definitely is not one of the dogs from around the neighborhood, and there's something about it that just doesn't look right to me. I turn to my friends to see what they think, and when they look to where I'm pointing, the dog is gone. And out of nowhere, there's this guy, dressed in some grubby clothes, long dirty hair, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, and definitely in need of a shave. The funny thing though, is that he's walking straight towards us and getting closer, but we still can't make out his eyes, almost as if he doesn't have any. Even though we were 3 against 1, without saying a word, we all just started running towards my house. Right up the porch we go, slamming the door behind us. No sooner are we inside, it's like every dog in the neighborhood is barking and whining as if they are scared. Then, just like that, everything gets real quiet, as if somebody hit the mute button. I'm not sure how long we stayed there crouched down low and against the wall beneath the windows. But finally, one of my friends elbows me in the shoulder and tells me with his head that I should take a look outside. Not wanting to look like a complete pussy, I move the curtain aside and peek out. I don't see anything, so I go and open the door. Whoever that guy was, he's gone, and everything seems as it always is. Needless to say, we hung out on the porch for the rest of the night. This story comes out of Arizona. 3 siblings are returning home to the reservation for a weekend visit with their parents. Their trip is taking them from Phoenix to the family home in Low Mountain in Pinyon. It's a trip of about 5 hours. They leave fairly late in the evening. As they approach Keams Canyon Highway, they turn onto a dirt road leading straight into Low Mountain. Just before they reach the dirt road, they notice an old lady bent from age and walking with a cane on the side of the highway. It is about 2 o'clock in the morning. She has a scarf over her head and a long black jacket beneath, and she is also wearing a green dress. Their only thought is that it's a late hour for walking along an isolated highway pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The reservation is really dark at night, and there is barely anyone driving on the roads. After they pass the old woman, they make the turn onto the dirt road. A mile later, they notice the same old lady, bent and walking with her cane there on the side of the dirt road. Spooked by the incident and finding no explanation that would provide for the woman's presence, they had been passed by no other vehicle since turning onto the back road. The older brother, who is driving, steps on the gas and puts distance between them and the roadside specter. Together, the 3 of them recite some words in Navajo to protect them from any dark medicine. Eventually, they reach the highway that leads to Chinle. As they come to the first overpass, they see that same old lady sitting on the shoulder pavement with her head down and waving the cane in the air. Before they can pass her by, the car stalls out, and they are required to roll to a stop a short distance past the woman. Desperately, the older brother attempts to get the car started, but there's no response. At this point, with all 3 of them panicking, the old lady stands up, facing the opposite way, so they can't see her face, and she walks to the other side of the road. Once there, she turns her head for but a moment, and they see that her face is painted black. She keeps walking and eventually disappears in the distance. Now, out of sight, the brother again turns the key in the ignition, and the car starts. They make it to their parents' home with no further encounters. When they tell their parents about the experience, their fathers tells them of an old Navajo couple with a house back in the trees somewhere between the 2 highways. They are rumored to practice bad medicine and bewitch people. From what he knows, the old man passed away recently, and ever since then, the old woman has been frequently seen at night, walking the highways and the back roads. The one and only time I went hunting was with my father when I was 11. My mom didn't work, so it was up to him to provide for us. My entire life he worked more than he was at home. When he did come home, he would drink in front of the TV, too exhausted to do anything. The years crept up on him, and he finally noticed how old I had gotten, and how I was already shaping up to be a disappointment in his eyes. I was small for my age. I stayed inside to read instead of playing sports. My body was so frail I got sick often. When he finally truly looked at me for the first time, he didn't recognize the son that lived in his house. Therefore, he thought that hunting would be the answer. If I would man up and shoot something, maybe I might grow into the person he wanted. We never really spent any time together. Hunting with my father felt like being stuck inside a forest with a stranger. What kind of person even enjoys camping? Was I even missing something? My father kept sipping away at a steel water bottle that I knew didn't have water inside. Without it, he never would have lasted the day. We caught no fish at the lake for lunch the first day. Trying out luck, we went into the forest trying to shoot something for dinner. We packed something to eat, but not much. My father worked hard. However, he was supporting all three of us on his own. I knew it would be four of us soon. My mom hadn't told him yet, and I wasn't sure how he would take it. I really prayed she would leave him. As heartless as that was to hope for, we could go to my uncle's house, so my father could be alone. Maybe retire in a few years without having to worry about supporting a family. Even as a child, I could see how much his job broke his body a little more every day. In my mind, my mother didn't have any kind of feelings for this stranger. Instead of going outside playing with neighborhood friends, I worried about my family's future. In the woods, hunkered down, my father waited for something to come into his sight. For the first time, he made the attempt to talk with me and teach me things. After a while, when he thought I could be trusted, he placed the rifle into my hands and let me get into position. It was far too big for my short arms and little hands. I was scared that if I shot it, the recoil would break my shoulder. I didn't know the first thing about guns. In the movies I had seen, they always had a powerful recoil. "Line it up, our dinner's over there," my father whispered in my ear. A rabbit came into a clearing. He spotted it first, looking through the sight. I went through everything I had just learned. I only needed to pull the trigger. Such a simple little thing. My father would teach me more things patiently and be proud of me. The first hunting trip with his son would become a cherished memory. But it didn't go like that. I froze up. I just couldn't shoot the rabbit. Aside from not wanting to kill another living creature, I felt like if I shot it, I would be living a lie. My father would try his best to act like the person he should be, teaching me how to skin the rabbit and how to cook it. But he would not actually care about me. He never did. This trip would never turn into a family relationship he wanted. The small rabbit jumped off and out of sight to become a meal for something else. I eased up the grip on the rifle the moment before it was snatched from my hands. My father shot at the rabbit now hidden in the bush. "Why didn't you shoot it?" he hissed at me. When he got angry, his voice got low. He was never the type to yell and scream. I wonder if he did shout at me, I might be less scared of him. Whenever I had a nightmare, it was always the same. My father sitting in the living room in the dark, staring at the TV. I stood in the doorway looking at him, just waiting. The waiting crept dread into my bones. I hated the wait. I wish he would just finally scream at me. I couldn't stand his silent rage any longer. "Go back to camp. You're useless." Those words should have done nothing to me. After all, this man wasn't my father. Not really. He was a stranger. And yet, I felt my face full of shame, but I still didn't regret not shooting the rabbit. I went back to the camp trying to make myself useful. I collected firewood, I cleaned up, and did anything else that I thought would make my father happy. I heard the sound of a truck. We parked pretty close by, and my stomach sank at the thought of him just leaving me here. But our gear cost a lot of money. He will leave his son in the woods, but not things he worked hard for. For hours I was alone in the tent. I brought a book along. I nearly finished it by the time my father returned. He smelled drunk and like fast food. I knew he had gone into town for supper and a few drinks alone. I only ate a hot dog and a handful of marshmallows. The arrangement was fine by me. The rest of the night he spent by the fire, just drinking. The scene identical to how he spent time at home, just looking forward yet not taking anything in. He stayed outside even after night fell. I went back into our tent trying to sleep, finding it impossible. I thought about how things would change when my new sibling came, if they ever made it to that point. I feared that my father would try to make sure that he didn't have another mouth to feed. I wanted nothing more to get away from that man, even though in a way, he had never done anything to me. The nothing made me feel as if something was coming. At some point I fell asleep, but some rustling outside woke me up. In my drowsy state I sat up hearing my father's voice outside. Take him, please. Not me. He was crying. The man that I didn't know a thing about was crying. His voice was very faint, as if far away, more begging and pleading until I heard something that made me scramble into the corner of the tent. He finally broke the silence, and the noise I always dreaded came. He screamed, and just kept screaming as if his life depended on it. Clutching my knees to my chest, tears came to my eyes as I could do nothing but listen. Cracks from the rifle came. Whatever he was firing at, he missed, or it didn't care. The entire exchange only took a few minutes that felt like years. Finally, his voice drifted away, as if he was being dragged at a fast pace. At first, I wanted to stay inside the tent until morning. I cried hard until my throat felt raw and my eyes hurt. When my crying spell stopped, I decided to see if he dropped the rifle. I would need a weapon until I could leave when dawn came. I unzipped the tent only enough to peek outside. The dying fire did not give enough light to see by. I needed to go outside. Finding a flashlight, I carefully got out, hyper aware of every sound around me. Scanning the ground, I saw the hot dogs were still where I left them. If my father was attacked by a wild animal, why didn't they take these as well? Did the smell attract something and decided a full-grown man would be a better meal? I saw no sign of the rifle, only tracks in the dirt where my father made his last stand. I felt sick because I realized he was coming towards the camp instead of the truck when he got snatched away. He was either trying to save me or wanted to use me as bait. Thinking the truck would be a better place to wait until the morning, I started to look around trying to find a trail towards it. I stopped when I heard a voice. Please, not me. Help. It sounded so hurt and awful, but I knew that was my father calling out. For the first time in my life, he was trying to reach me. I abandoned the idea of the truck. I foolishly turned away and went towards the voice. For hours I walked in those woods getting hopelessly lost. I felt sick with fear. Anything could be in the dark, and I only had a small flashlight to protect myself. Whatever took my father easily overpowered a full-grown man. I didn't have a choice if it came across me. I would let my emotions take over and it might get me killed. Then again, I was only a child back then, so I shouldn't be too hard on myself. Please, Please." The voice came from close by, very low and raspy, but still my father's voice. I had been walking for hours at that point. My small body wasn't meant to move this much in the cold, wet darkness. I knew a fever already coming, and wasn't thinking clearly as I walked towards the voice. I didn't even consider it may be someone else aside from who I wanted to find. Coming into a clearing, I started to look around with my flashlight. The small beam of light landed on something that made me choke on air. Someone killed a deer, skinned it, and hung it from a tree. In the darkness, that's what it looked like. I knew what a skinned deer looked like. It's what my mind wanted to see. The kill was so fresh, blood still dripped down onto the grass. I couldn't stop myself from starting to take a shorter and shorter breath when a whisper of a thought came to my mind that the body wasn't a deer. "That's not him," I said out loud, only to myself. "That's not him. It's a deer. It's a small deformed deer with small legs." Unable to stop myself, I suddenly hunched over and threw up my meal from hours before, mostly bile that stung my throat. Seeing such a sight in the dark made me completely snap. Instead of screaming, I started to laugh, on my knees alone, lost and scared beyond words. Weak chuckles at first, that turned into a cackling, that soon turned into heavy sobs that locked up my chest. "It's not him." I was sobbing, holding myself, not being able to look at the body in front of me. After getting another few glances between tears, I saw how different the legs were compared to what deer legs should look like. I only held on to some hope it wasn't my father skinned and hanging from a tree, because I had just heard him a few minutes before entering the clearing. The kill was new, but skinning took a while, even if you knew what you were doing. In the next few moments, I saw why my hope was unfounded. I forced myself to stop crying when I saw a pale face in the dark on the other end of the clearing. The face looked at me through the trees, just beyond the skinned body. I opened my mouth to ask for help, but nothing came out aside from a croak. To my horror, the face came out of the trees with the rest of its terrible body. I didn't understand what I was seeing, even though the pale creature stood out in the darkness. I wanted to believe I was still in my tent dreaming this entire thing. The monster was a thing of nightmares. It was skinny, so much so I could see every bone in its body. It had arms so long they walked on its elbows, the rest of its arms folding backwards, sticking up above its head. The same was for its legs. It crawled on its knees, legs pointed up towards the sky. The pale thing saw me. Inhuman sunken eyes on a flat human-shaped face. Standing up, I thought I could run. It was still a few feet away, and judging from how deformed its body was, I doubt it could move very fast. I only got to take a single step back when it raised an arm. The rest of its arm snapped ahead, easily covering the distance of the clearing. I assumed it couldn't reach more with its entire arm because it was bent back, but I was mistaken. Twisted fingers grabbed the front of my shirt. I was dragged, too in shock to do anything. Raising me up, I met those horrible black eyes. The smell of rotting breath nearly made me pass out. I was so small and frail I could do nothing to fight against this monster. Most likely my father was dead. It would skin me and eat me, and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. The whole situation was so bleak. I surprised myself over what I did next. I started to laugh again. The monster's features twisted in confusion. I still laughed until tears came back to my eyes, and that thing, whatever it was, copied me. It laughed my own voice back towards me, and we both ended up laughing until I physically couldn't any longer. I wish I had an explanation of how I escaped from that creature. I was told later that I had been found on a hiking trail a week later, nearly starved to death. Even after my body recovered, my mind didn't. Everyone assumed I had killed my father in those woods, and the event just broke me. I wish I could believe that, and that the creature I had seen wasn't real. I don't remember the 2 years after I had been found. I ate and slept, not doing much else. One day, I weakly laughed at a joke I overheard. When the doctors found out I would react to any kind of comedy, they were able to get me to laugh myself back to a new normal. I remember seeing that monster in the woods. Then, I was with my mother and a new little sister. No memories in between. I haven't yet told her about that creature. They found some rope with my father's blood on it. However, they didn't know where his body was, or even how I got up into the tree to tie up that rope to start with. The case was still open, and would be for the rest of my life. I do still want to give a warning to everybody about that thing in the woods. I'm sure it's still out there waiting. I don't know why it let me go. Maybe it was thankful I had given it the perfect voice to draw in others towards it. So if you ever go into the woods and you hear a child laughing, don't go towards it. That's actually the time to leave before it's too late. In 1987, my family and I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, a nice place, smaller than most cities, but interesting. The people there were kind, at least in the inner city. In the neighborhood where my family had moved, everyone was quiet and kept to themselves. Real quaint if you were the type of person who liked those kind of things. For me, I found it odd. No one talked to my family or bothered to communicate while we were staying there. It was like they were hiding some kind of secret. But I did notice one thing. No one came near the house. At first I thought I understood why. The house wasn't exactly in good shape, if you know what I mean. The walls outside were rusted. The grass outside was tall and filled with bushes, and the place looked like a dump. But after a while, I started to notice things. People on the streets wouldn't come near the house at all. They acted as if it was going to devour them or something. Kids on the street would point and stare, and eventually, after I started school, I learned just why the people there were so afraid of our house. You know that place is haunted. That's the first thing someone said to me as I stepped into school. Not even a single hello or a welcome. No, I got nothing of that. At first I was a bit confused. What's haunted? I said to the kid in front of me, the one who decided to make that statement. He didn't say anything. He just turned around and started walking away. I was a bit curious now. I wonder if what that kid said was true, or if it was just some kind of prank, something to pull on the new kid. But I was very wrong. I now know. School went on for a while, and everything seemed fine. My father and mother were happy. My sister, she was happy as well. But I noticed things started to happen to me. I would wake up in the middle of the night with a heavy feeling on my chest. It was as if something was laying on top of me or pressing against my body. But when I opened my eyes, nothing was there. During those nights I swore I was being watched, as if someone was stalking me. There was this dark corner in my room that would appear every night. It was the only part of my room that was invisible during the nighttime. It was from that corner that I felt something watching me, as if someone was standing there. But I was too afraid to ever go and check. Not to mention, I was always very tired. and I tried to shrug it off and sleep, until one night, that is. As I laid in bed that night, I was having trouble sleeping as usual. That heavy feeling on my chest had returned, and it was getting hard for me to breathe. I had this feeling of overwhelming fear, but I didn't know why. It was like I was fearing for my dear life, without any reason. My eyes were open slightly, and as I gazed around the room, I swore I saw the shadows moving in the moonlight, zooming past my vision as if they were getting closer and closer. Eventually, the shadows formed into what appeared to be a man in a dark, long cloak. I then woke up fully. I took a deep breath and I backed up against the wall behind my bed. But after that, I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed or something. Whatever that thing was, that man, was coming closer. It sat down on my bed and it began to crawl towards me. I saw its dark hands press against my covers. The fingers resembled claws of some sort, but that wasn't its most terrifying feature. It had no face, no eyes. It was just darkness, a living shadow. I was panicking now. It kept coming closer and closer until it was in my face. You know, my parents always told me to pray when I felt scared, that God would answer my prayers and protect me. Well, he must have forgotten about me this time, because no amount of prayer whatsoever seemed to be helping. This thing was in my face. Its hands were reaching out, and just as it touched my face, it spoke in the deepest, darkest voice I had ever heard. I couldn't make out what it said. It was speaking in some kind of odd language, but even if it spoke English, I doubt I would have listened. I was too scared, too shaken up to pay attention. This thing spoke to me for I don't know how long, its dark, shadowy figure looming over me as it trailed its claw-like finger across my cheek, cutting into my skin slightly as some blood leaked down into my shirt. I thought this was it. I really thought I was going to die that night. However, I heard a knock at my door. I was relieved in some ways, but I was still scared that this thing was sitting on top of me, and for all I knew, it was about to eat or kill me or something. After the third knock, my mother walked into the room, and she looked over at me. She couldn't see anything. I guess she acted like I wasn't there, as if I wasn't in my room. Maybe that thing on top of me blocked her view. I really don't know, but all hope was drained from my body at that very moment. I figured this was it. I was done for. But in the blink of an eye, I saw that thing get off me. It walked back to the spot where it first formed, and it began to change. My mother had left the room by now, but I was more focused on what this thing was turning into. For a moment, it looked as if I was staring into a silhouette of myself. The creature, the man, this being, whatever it was, it then waved to me, its still dark and shadowy body fading into a black mist. I didn't stay in that room. I got up, I ran downstairs, and I slept on the couch, with every light on possible. The next morning, I awoke early, before everyone else. I packed some clothes, small food, and some extra cash that my father had left in a jar on top of the fridge. I wrote a small note detailing what happened on the counter in the kitchen. Then I left, and I never looked back. I was 17 at the time, but mentally, I felt much older. I eventually crossed state lines, going back to my home state of Texas, where I got a job as a clerk in some crappy little convenience store on the south side of Dallas. Times were tough, but I pushed through. To be honest, I had been wanting to leave home for a long time. I just needed a reason to do it. In some fucked up way, I guess what happened was that reason. But looking back, I never did hear from my family again. I sent them letters, pictures, but nothing. I never got anything back. I figured they either forgot about me, or they simply just didn't care. It wasn't until recently that I began to research on what happened that night. I had been having odd dreams lately. It seemed that this strange, heavy feeling on my chest had returned. I didn't know why, but I felt that if this thing was coming back for me, I wanted to know what it was. I then visited the local library, but I didn't find much interest. The closest I came to anything was an old Navajo legend called yenaglooshi. Apparently, it was a demonic force, or a person that would assume the shape of animals or people. It seemed logical, but I couldn't understand what such a thing would want with me. I was scared. I didn't sleep for 3 days straight, until someone I hadn't seen in a very long time showed up at my door. My mother. She was happy to see me, but she didn't seem that different since when I last saw her. Now mind you, I hadn't seen her for 25 years. I found it a bit odd that she still looked so young, but I shrugged it off. I was happy to see her. So very happy. We talked for a while, but something was off. Every time she looked at me, I got this cold feeling in my body. I felt as if I was staring at a different person. And after a while, I began to feel weak. I was tired. I hadn't slept for days. So I just went up to my room. Before that, however, my mother was telling me how my father left not long after I did, and that he took my sister with her. It was shocking, but I didn't care so much. I just wanted to sleep. But as I lay down in my bed, that feeling returned. That very same feeling I hadn't felt in 25 years. Someone is watching me from the corner of my room. I'm trying not to pay attention. I'm simply going to turn over and close my eyes. I'm not sure though if I'll make it through this night. I don't know if anyone will ever find this, but if you do, please find my family, inform them of what happened here,